And on that note, I should just introduce them. So Christopher Pollon is an independent journalist who reports on the politics of natural resources, focusing on mining, oceans, and energy. And his work has appeared in dozens of publications, including National Geographic, Vice, The Walrus, The Tyee, Globe and Mail. And he's also the author of The Peace in Peril, which is a stunning book on the impacts of the Site C Dam. Thanks for being here, Chris. And Francesca Fionda is the Narwhal's mining reporter and a regular contributor at Tyee, and she was recently awarded the first ever Lieutenant Governor's BC Journalism Fellowship for an in-depth project called Bracing for Disasters, which looks at the challenges of people who have been evacuated because of climate disasters. Amazing to have you here. So they're gonna talk for about 45 minutes, and then they're gonna open it up to questions from the audience, so start thinking about a very smart question. Questions, please, don't lecture us. Nobody likes a lecture, so please think of a great question. And now please join me in welcoming Chris and Francesca on stage.
All right, hello. Thank you everyone for that warm welcome. And Christopher, thank you again for making time. Oh, yes, join us. And as Jorge mentioned, we're going to be spending the next 45 minutes or so talking about mining and Christopher's book, Pitfall, which is right over there. So get your questions ready as we engage in this topic. Jorge mentioned off the top that mining is a resource extraction industry, and I think it's important to acknowledge once again that this is an industry that happens often without consultation or consent on Indigenous lands all across the world, and including here in Canada and BC. Chris shares some examples in his book from Guatemala, Bolivia, Brazil, and Chile. And if you, like me, are a visitor and a settler on this land, it's important that we all keep learning about the ongoing impacts of colonization. And I know that the Vancouver Public Library has a really great collection on Indigenous literature, so I encourage everybody to check that out. So Christopher, this is your book. It covers a huge topic, mining. And it goes from the past, present, and future. And you open with this idea that mining is something that's invisible and everywhere all at once, which is something that really stuck with me. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about what got you interested in, why did you start this book?
Sure. So as you just said, mining is this paradoxical subject, and it's this thing where it's ubiquitous in our lives. We can't live without it. We can't, our cell phones, just for example, that we have, there's 60 mined elements in that phone. And my book starts around 1950 at the end of the Second World War. And at that point in time, right up to that point in time, humanity only made use of about a dozen mined things. And if you fast forward to now, we use almost every element in the periodic table. It gives you an idea of the expansion that's occurred, and yes, the progress, because without mining, our civilization could not exist. Our comforts couldn't exist. And that's a point that that sometimes well-meaning activists failed to recognize, and that's one of the fundamental premises of my book, is that we have to live with this industry, but how do we do that? And how do we minimize the harms that come from the industrial mining that we need to get this stuff, especially the uptick we're gonna need for the clean energy transition. With the world we hope to replace, the fossil fuel world, is less metals intensive than the clean energy world. So we're either gonna have to massively ramp up mining, and we will need to do a lot of new mining, but the question is how much? And the question of how much is gonna be up to us, ultimately.
Yeah, I definitely wanna dig into some of that, no pun intended. But when I mean, you traveled the world to cover this topic. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the places you visited, some of the maybe key moments from your journey?
COVID happened during my book, so I actually only went to Chile and Bolivia, and everywhere else. It was kind of ironic how I was able to use technology that was enabled by all the rare earths and all that copper and everything else, but it was from the loft of my home, where I did a lot. But Bolivia and Chile were very important places that I went to in spite of it was the difficulties at the end of COVID. Bolivia in particular, I come from a mining family. My family all emigrated from northern Italy, and we all came to Timmins. It's the gold fields up, and so they, all my relatives came over, and so we were transmigrants. And the Italians, like a lot of other Europeans, were traveled all over the world or left Europe. And my dad used to tell me that, we had the choice between Argentina, Brazil, I guess, and Canada and Australia. And a lot of Italians, the huge diaspora of the Italians are everywhere around those countries. And mining is a big reason why. And that's how we establish ourselves. And Bolivia had a special resonance for me because the men in my family that didn't go into the mines were worked in railroads and breweries and these support industries for mining, because Timmins is a mining town, and everything serves mining. And my grandfather, who worked in the mines, he got silicosis really bad. It took about 20 years. He was a mucker in underground gold mines. And when I was in Bolivia, I had the chance to go into a mine that was absolutely identical to the kind of mine that my grandfather would have worked in the late 20s. And there were men around his age at the time who, already in their early 30s had silicosis. And the life expectancy, a lot of them were going to reach 50. And so a big surprise and shock to me is that we think of mining and industrial mining, and in Canada, it's improved a lot. But there's about 45 million people in the world at this moment who make their living doing what they call artisanal mining, which is everything from hands, shovels to small equipment, and industrial miners, they produce the bulk of mining and the stuff we use, but a smaller percentage, we still get that from these artisanal miners. And the conditions are pretty much similar to what my grandfather lived through. So, and that really resonated, and one of my favorite parts of the book is when I go into this mine and I draw a parallel between what he lived through and what these men were trying to cope with in Bolivia. And it was like a silver zinc mine. Yeah. I
mean, you're drawing a lot of connections to mining, to your own personal history, and then even to us as we sit here with our cell phones out there. It is like you're drawing that picture of kind of invisible but everywhere all at once. I guess we're sitting here in Vancouver, Canada, and maybe you can paint kind of a picture of how are we situated in the global mining industry.
About 50% of the mining companies, publicly traded mining companies in the world, are based in Canada. And a vast majority of those companies are junior mining companies, which do mining exploration. And it's a specialty that Canadians have developed. And Canadians basically invented the junior mining company. And what that is that it's a small, very nimble corporate vehicle to raise money. And it's by its nature high risk, because the odds of finding minerals on a mineral property that a company might get are very, very small. And so the risks, and so what Canada developed was these nimble little companies that can raise money, go around, and also just the means of venture capital to high risk investment in these companies. And so in Vancouver alone, Greater Vancouver, there's between 800 and I was told recently, someone said 1,000 junior mining companies. And that concentration is huge if you consider that, that Vancouver is by no means a center for an international center of finance, right? So and Toronto is an even bigger center, and that's the home to the 2 stock exchanges that service. So Canada is a financial center for mining exploration, and at its best, Canadians are in every corner of the earth right now, drilling and looking for the metals we need. And at its worst, these are speculative vehicles, lifestyle companies, zombie companies that basically just absorb and suck up investor money. So there's the best of 2 worlds there.
And you mentioned throughout the book, even in the far reaches of the world from here, there are subsidiaries and all these connections to different, mining companies that have their roots here in Canada.
For sure. Like some of the bigger companies, like Barrick Gold, which is based in Toronto, it's a Canadian company, but it has over 120, I think the number the last I checked was 120 mines, subsidiaries, and other corporate structures, and they're based all over the world. So a modern mining corporation is transnational by its nature, and a big mining company, and Canada has, I think, about 7 or 8 so-called majors. We still specialize a lot in gold and copper, but these are big companies, and they very different from the junior mining situation.
And so when people think of mines, maybe they've seen photos from up high, they've seen tailings dams, which are kind of holding together some of the byproducts of mines and one of the longer lasting impacts of mining. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the impact of tailings, and I know there's a part in the book, an anecdote that was one of your favorite ones, that kind of really illustrates how long lasting these tailings storage facilities can be, or just the byproduct of mining.
Tailings are the Achilles heel of mining. It's something that we need metals, but we also need to minimize the number of tailings dams we build. And at this moment, there's between 10,000 and 30,000 tailings dams just in various stages of decline across the planet. And we don't know how many, because it's no one's job really to keep track, for one. And B, massive mining countries like China and Russia aren't going to tell us. And so there's these liabilities that are all over the landscape. And like I said, it's the Achilles heel of the industry. And we need, if we need to, my premise is that we need to limit the numbers of mines we dig, big industrial mines, simply because we need to limit the number of tailings dams that are left long after companies no longer exist. Because one disturbing aspect about tailings and mine sites is that a lot of times big earthen dams that store tailings and all the waste rock that might be on a site for a big mine will require permanent treatment and permanent attention. And forever is not something that a publicly traded company can navigate. And it's almost unfair to expect it to navigate that. I mean, in 400 years, is X company going to be there to make sure their water treatment plant is working? That's why it's important to try to limit the number of, we need to build what's necessary and dispense with what we don't need. And that's part of a challenge, which I get into that with gold, which I have pointed out recently is doesn't have a lot of practical uses. And so dedicated gold mines are something that I'm not sure if they should exist. I don't know how we get there, and people think I'm crazy saying that.
Well, when you say they don't have a lot of dedicated uses, you mean that mostly they're end up in jewelry versus other products?
That's right. Like the World Gold Council, I saw stats from them, and about 50% of gold production goes into jewelry. And only about 10% goes into industrial uses. So the long and short of that is that we could stop dedicated industrial gold mining. I have to say that. We could stop doing that tomorrow, and we would still have the gold we need for what we need. Now, jewelry is another thing, and also a huge amount of the gold is, we go through this process of purifying it and creating bullion, and it ends up just sitting in what's basically a subterranean jail cell, and it just seems kind of crazy to me, given the cost. By some estimates, like the wedding band I have on my finger, it's about 1/3 of an ounce, and the estimate from Earthworks did an analysis where they said that about 20 tons of waste was generated creating my wedding band. And someone had challenged that statistic, and so I reached out to Earthworks this week, and they told me that was an old statistic, and that ore grades for gold are going down a lot, and that they said it's probably more like 30 tons.
Wow. So yeah, when ore grades go down, that means essentially what's coming out of the ground has a lot less material in it and requires more processing, more waste. Is that kind of how it goes? Sure,
and that speaks to the point about we need to make better use of the gold that's already above the ground as much as we can, because recycling rates are, recycling's not a silver bullet. There's a lot of issues with it that are going to prevent us from digging new mines. But we need to make better use of what we already have, right? So I was just going to do that little Yucca Mountain thing.
Yeah. So I think it gives us a good perspective on just how long the impacts of mining can be and how we think about it.
So I was just going to read a really brief thing. It's one of my favorite stories in the book, and just to set it up a little bit, Yucca Mountain is this mountain in Nevada. Where in the early 90s, the US government decided that it was going to try to build a repository for all the high-level nuclear waste. And this is stuff that's dangerous to store. And so and it's all over the country in these little piecemeal sort of bits. And it's like stuff from nuclear plants, weapons development, and it's also from mining, of course, processing. And so they came up with this plan to build a repository. And this kind of gets to the heart of the problem with that issue of forever when it comes to the waste that we create and the waste that we need to find ways to prevent generating in the first place. So when the Yucca Mountain repository was planned in the early 1990s to store 70,000 tons of radioactive waste and plutonium in subterranean tunnels in Nevada, expected to remain dangerously toxic for 100,000 years, the US Department of Energy convened a team of engineers, archaeologists, anthropologists, and linguists to design effective warning structures capable of lasting at least 10,000 years. Their challenge was to communicate the danger to future civilizations long after ours is gone. So they proposed encircling the dump with 20-ton polished granite monuments, patterned after Stonehenge, and burying thousands of small warning tablets inspired by the diorite stela inscribed with the laws of the 18th century BC Babylonian king Hammurabi. Assuming our current languages and cultures would no longer exist, the designers also proposed using Munch's The Scream and the skull and crossbones as symbolic warnings. The punchline to this story was that when the US government convened a meeting of local indigenous groups to tell them about the plan to warn future generations about Yucca Mountain, The indigenous leaders found it outrageously funny. Don't worry, one of the community members reportedly said. We will tell them where it is.
Thanks for sharing that. I think, yeah, I can hear people already chuckling at this whole idea of, you know, trying to grapple with how long this industry lasts, but also that, you know, acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years.
Well, and also just the fact that the memory that they have, like who in this room from a settler culture could say that in 10,000 years that your language and culture and experience would, and have certainty that it would exist in 10,000 years. It's astounding. And it says, to me, it says everything about the wisdom of Indigenous people and the connection that they have to the resources and to the land, right?
And you're talking about in terms of just trying to figure out what to do with all this mining waste. A big part of that, of creating that, is using up water in terms of the mining process, and tailings can often have a lot of slurry, like you mentioned. It'll include a lot of byproduct from mining, but using water that would potentially be used for drinking water, or desalinating the ocean just to get this process through. And I'm curious what you learned about how we're using water, and maybe some examples of that came across in your book that really maybe made you scratch your head.
Yeah, Chile was a place that I had to go to for this book. And I wanted to go physically there because Chile produces about a quarter of the world's copper right now. And copper is probably the most important metal that we're going to need for the clean energy transition. And they are in the throes, Chile is in the throes of about a 15-year mega drought. And we're already starting to see water being and climate change by extension being a limiting factor in the metal we can get out of the ground, which is a big problem because we're going to need a lot of copper in the future. And so when I was there, BHP, which is one of the biggest mining companies in the world, I think it's the biggest right now, they're based in Australia, and they had recently built a desalination plant, the biggest desalination plant in the entire Americas, to supply their Escondida copper mine, which is the biggest copper mine in the world. And so what they're doing, the lengths they're going to get water, they need fresh water to concentrate the copper. It's a water-intensive process. And so they're desalinating, which is an enormously energy-intensive process, and then they have to pipe it up by pipeline almost 2 kilometers up into the Andes. And what's fascinating, what's fascinating about Chile is that, and copper, is that the Andes mountain chain, which starts up in Venezuela and goes all the way down to Patagonia, is basically this 5,000 kilometer long deposit of low-grade copper. And so Chile it's this thin country that just envelops so much of that wealth. And so BHP, what they have done is they have substituted a water problem and turned it into an energy problem, right? So they have the water they need now, but now it's an energy issue. And energy costs will inevitably go up. And that's a problem with a lot of the lower grade ores that we're trying to dig up now. It'll require more energy to crush more rock and sift through more rock.
And you also shared an example too in the book of how there was consideration of actually moving glacier so that the mine could expand.
Right. Well, in the Andes, that's a big problem, is that there's conflict now because glaciers are water, right? Obviously, and during times of drought, farming communities and just everyone living in these valleys require, it's an emergency water supply. And the problem too is that quite often, glaciers happen or they exist in areas where there's also mineral deposits. And so Pascua Lama was Barrick's attempt to do this mine that was the first binational mine, I think, in history where the actual mine straddled the border, way up in the mountains, straddled the border of Argentina and Chile. And the problem with the mine was that there was a couple different glaciers on the site that were in the way of the deposits were beneath it. And it's a tremendously rich deposit. And at one point, Barrick had proposed to break up the glaciers and transport them, and transport the pieces, the ice cubes, I don't know, the pieces by truck to another area where another glacier existed where there weren't any minerals beneath it, where life presumably would continue on for the glacier. And it's this principle called no net loss that you see a lot in resource development. And it didn't work, and I think that they had to backtrack on that. But the long and short of it is that mine was never built. And it's still a very valuable thing, and there's still efforts to develop it, particularly now on the Argentinian side. And
so you painted this picture of, using up water as a very energy-intensive process, possibly moving glaciers, tailings that are lasting forever, and yet we hear a lot this argument that in order to kind of decarbonize our economy, we have to electrify. That requires more batteries, more EVs, more electric vehicles, and to do that, we need to do more mining. And so, what did you learn about that argument, and what are some of the things that you heard from industry as they made this argument for a green future? We need to build more mines.
Well, we need to do more mining for the clean energy transition, and there's no doubt about that. But what I came to see as problematic is that we haven't really had a discussion of what the clean energy transition is and what it should be. And so is the clean energy transition just us swapping, the 1.4 billion gas cars and replacing them with electric vehicles? And maybe people in rich countries feel like they can buy an EV and feel good about that. And maybe that's all they do. But what is the clean energy transition? What are we going to do, and how far are we going to go? If it's replacing every EV, we might have a problem. I think we need to build back smarter, or find ways to build back smarter, and that'll include making better use of what we have above ground, including how we deal with those things.
Yeah, what do I do with this after? I hope that there are ways that you talked a little bit about recycling in the book too, and just do people have turned to it as an idea, kind of like urban mining almost, being able to extract the minerals from things that are in objects today? Like, how possible is that, and where are we when it comes to that?
I was a bit disappointed with where recycling is for metals when I did an inquiry about that, because in 2013, I'd done a story where I had looked at recycling rates, global recycling rates for metals. And it ended up that a lot of the recycling rates, in 2011, there was a study that looked at most of the metals in the periodic table, and it found that only about 18 out of 60 that they looked at had over 50% recycling rates, which is pretty dismal. And things like rare earths and stuff like that, most of them we just throw out. It's hard because they're in tiny quantities and stuff. And so it flash forward, and I think copper and aluminum, we're doing better with that. But the recycling rates are still low, and a huge problem is the fact that unlike things like plastic or paper, a lot of I'll use copper as an example. There's a lot of copper behind these walls that allow us to have light and electricity. And think about how long that copper is tied up in this building. So you don't have ready supplies. You can't rely on ready supplies of recycled materials, of metals. Right,
so they're locked up for years before we can actually access them.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's the downcycling aspect, which is a lot of metals. Theoretically, we can recycle them forever, but the problem is that the way things are designed, quite often we can't recycle pure streams of these metals, which means that a good example might be steel that's got plastic and all this stuff in it that they recycle. It can't go back into a car. I think that's kind of idea.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we turn it to folks for their questions as well. So if you've been percolating, now's your chance. But before we turn it to you, I got to talk about space mining.
Got to talk about space.
Is that real? What's happening? We heard we were talking earlier that there was a recently there will be a mission to launch and take a look at an asteroid with a high metal content. But is this real? Is this a future possibility?
I was really disappointed at how far away space mining is, or probably is, or I hope it is now that I've learned more about it. So NASA launched, they were supposed to launch today this mission to go look at this metallic asteroid, and it's called 16 Psyche, and so this metallic asteroid is stuck in this asteroid belt that is stuck in the sun's orbit between Mars and Jupiter, and they think that it's composed largely of iron and nickel. And there've been they don't know a lot about this, but they think that it could be very valuable, like so valuable that if we could ever liberate and somehow drag this giant metallic space rock to Earth, that it would just it would blow up metal markets would be destroyed, and there'd be markets based on scarcity just wouldn't exist. So it's science fiction, but very interestingly though, in the first decade of the 2000s, there was a brief boom where there were a bunch of asteroid mining companies that came to the fore. One of them was called Planetary Resources, and James Cameron got behind it. All the tech billionaires got behind it because it was very exciting, and they were talking about things like this 16 Psyche asteroid, which they were saying the world's first trillionaire will be a space miner, right? And so that kind of talk kind of got people really excited. And in less than a decade, before the industry even existed, it went through this cycle of spectacular boom and spectacular bust, simply because the timeline to seeing profitability was like 40 and 50 years. And again, that was completely speculative. None of the equipment or anything they needed to do this existed. It was complete science fiction. It was just cool, right?
Yeah, I'm imagining like the reverse Armageddon movie. We send Bruce Willis up and then maybe he brings it back down. No?
Yeah. I don't know. So now one footnote to this that I do find intriguing is that mining is going to happen in space in the shorter term, but it's not going to be for valuable metals. It's going to be for ice. And in fact, the entire future of human space exploration will probably hinge on whether we can successfully mine for example, send out a probe to the moon, treat the moon like a gas station, and pick up the ice and use that ice to make fuel to jump onto other places. And so mining in space is going to be important, but it's not for platinum or gold like those company guys dreamed of.
Right.
It's going to be ice on the moon.
For future exploration, not into space, not here. Yeah. Cool. Well, maybe I'll just pause there to see if there's any folks that have a question you want to ask now, because I can keep going here. But is there anybody that wants to you can just put your hand up. Yes, there in the back.
Very fascinating talk. These days we hear a lot about lithium, and I've seen images from Africa, people mining it under very primitive, brutal conditions. But I hear now that didn't the USA recently declare that they had a huge finding of lithium? Can you just tell us what we need to know about lithium? I find it fascinating.
Yeah. So I'll just repeat the question in case anybody wasn't able to hear, but the question was around lithium. Can we talk a little bit more about what it is, what impact it's having, and where are we finding it?
The reference to Africa was probably cobalt, which is another thing that's in batteries. But lithium is very important to the current. Currently, like for example, EV batteries rely on lithium-ion technology, and so that takes a fair amount of lithium. And where we're finding it, it comes from two sources. In Bolivia and Chile, they have these old dead salt lakes, these massive dry desert salt lakes, where beneath they drill into it, and there's lithium in these brines that they suck up. And there's big drying pools, and it comes from brines in South America, but increasingly it comes in hard rock as well, and Australia leads the way with that. So lithium's a resource that we're going to need a lot of in the future. And one thing that I find fascinating about lithium is that in very recent history, we've seen a bunch of countries basically nationalize their lithium supplies, because a lot of poor countries want to be sure that if the world needs all this lithium, they want to make sure that they're going to get a real benefit from it. So Mexico, Chile, and I think even and one African country, at least one African country, have nationalized their supplies. And what that simply means is that they want the state to control it. Outsiders can come in, but they kind of need to work on their terms, right? And so, yeah, and that's part of the geopolitics of the clean energy transition and how it relates to metals. And lithium is really kind of a good indicator of where we're at with that.
Yeah, just up at the front here.
You mentioned, or you asked, what is the energy transition? And it pretty much narrowed the conversation to EVs. But can you expand on that? Because energy transition is not just about electric vehicles.
I'll just repeat the question again. Was about what is the energy transition, and what is it beyond electric vehicles?
Yeah, good question. So there'll be electrical generation. So solar, wind, the things you hear of, solar ways to generate electricity. But one thing that's often overlooked is even just what we're going to need to build to store that energy. Because the wind and sun are intermittent sources. Like the sun doesn't always shine. We're going to need battery technology and infrastructure where we can reliably store electricity, energy, so that we have it for, we have backups, everything. So we're talking about transportation, we're talking about generation, and we're talking about storage. And storage is the one that some people have been sounding the alarm about because, again, very metals intensive. And some people are speculating we're going to need a crazy amount of metals to be able to store the energy we need if we're serious about actually getting rid of fossil fuels and doing something else.
Yeah, in the black.
So I think if I'm correct in understanding that part of the point of your book was to look at how do we minimize the impact of mining in a necessary thing or increase positive impact of mining. And I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more about what you found or what your conclusions were around that.
So the question was, maybe, I think you even started your premise of the book. You told me a little bit about looking for good companies or some good practices. Is that kind of along the lines of the question? Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about what you learned and some of that?
Yeah, so when I started out working on the book, I had this vision to do this global scan and look at how we were mining in the world. And what I was going to try to highlight what we were doing right, kind of expose and shine a light on what we were doing wrong. And the idea would be that, this is who we should emulate and this is who we shouldn't. And what I discovered very quickly was that, especially with big mining companies that have huge portfolios of mines, every mine is unique in the world. And the ore body is unique. The conditions on the ground are unique around it. Whether community buys in or not is unique. Maybe it's in the headwaters of an important river system, and maybe there's no water problems at all. So I wasn't really able to, I had to abort that approach. And maybe one thing I will say that is positive is that's emerged, is that there's a process that, I don't know if you've heard of fair trade paper products, that FSC certification, that kind of thing. But there's something called IRMA. And what it is, it's a process that mines go through. And what it does is there's a bunch of best practices, and it just compares everything that they're doing to what's in this body of best practices. And it's the most promising thing we have right now, I think. And one thing that surprised me was Anglo American, which is one of the biggest companies, mining companies in the world. They've committed to have all their mines put through this process. And to do that is brave, and it also means that they are breaking with the pack largely with other companies. And I think that what you'll see is if they stick with this, that they'll be rewarded in the marketplace, because through this IRMA process, not only are mining companies members of this, but Tesla, all these big companies, big automakers, big manufacturers like Samsung. And the idea is that they're going to provide preferential treatment to companies that prove that they're transparent and that they're trying to do better on the ground, which is a start, and I think it's important. So I was able to find something positive there to draw out.
Yeah, so IRMA, and if people are interested in seeing the list, you can go online, IRMA, it's Initiative
That's
for
right.
Responsible Mining Assurance. Yes, assurance.
Yeah, you got it.
And they're also working on a guidelines as well for exploration industry right now. So those are draft.
Cool.
But, yeah.
Recently, there's been discovery of a lot of nodules in the deep sea in pretty remote places and beyond national boundaries and so forth. And there's been a certain thrust by mining companies to look into extracting some of those resources. What do you know? What do you think about the viability and some of the dangers of that?
Yeah, so the question was about deep sea mining. So we went to space, so now we're going to go deep underwater into the international seafloor. The question was around, what do you know about the viability of that? What are some of the impacts? What have you heard in terms of the deep sea mining industry?
There's a lot of metals in the ocean, and what you hear the most about they're called nodules. They're like these potato-sized rocks that are on the bottom. And one of the richest areas where they're found is in this almost 2 million square mile area that's right off the coast of Mexico, and with Hawaii on the other side. And so that's the richest ground for that. And it's very interesting that the leading company that's doing this has emerged as they're using in their approach to marketing, they've basically taken the language of anti-mining nonprofit groups and turned it towards mining, though. So, for example, they point to how destructive land mining is. And, for example, strip mining in Indonesia for nickel, which is nickel is something we need for batteries a lot. And so they'll show, I was at a presentation and they showed this image of strip mine, and it's a apocalyptic image. But then they would show another image of an area that had been dragged with a plow or something 30 years before, and it looked pristine. So the idea is that they're going to hoover up these nodules. And the environmental concern of this is that in doing so, you're going to create these curtains of sediment and that could travel very long distances. And we don't really know anything about the deep sea, about the life there, just just the role that the deep sea plays in sequestering carbon. And it seems like a real gamble to me, but it's something that we could easily do. Right now, it looks like they're working on regulations, and there was and I think they're looking at, originally they said 2024 potentially, but now it's more towards the end of 2025 that this leading company hopes to do it. And Francesca has written a lot about this too.
I know that there are no regulations right now that countries agree upon in terms of how we are going to, if we do mine the deep ocean. So it's still a big question, but yeah, industry is keen to do it in the next few years. That's for sure. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned briefly about tailings ponds and how you went to these countries. Did you ever do any research in BC, like for instance Mount Polley, which was one of the biggest tailing disasters ever? And also, did you, I'm sorry I haven't read your book, but I will. Did you look at any underground mining and how that, I know your book is titled Pitfall, which obviously is open pit, but did you look also at underground?
So the two questions there were about tailings dams and Mount Polley. Maybe you can give people a bit of a background on what that is. And then the other question was about underground mining and the impacts of that.
Okay, so Mount Polley was a mine disaster that happened in British Columbia in 2014. And it was, the tailings dam failed, and just an immense amount of mining effluent ended up in Quesnel Lake, which it was August, and it was the height of the sockeye migration season. And I don't know if anyone knows that part of the world very well, but I mean, that rearing, it's a massive lake, and it's a sockeye rearing lake that there's very few of those left in the world. It's just like a treasure. So the timing was brutal. And so what ended up happening was that the company was never assessed a cent in fines. They never paid a cent in fines. And in the end, they sued their contractor engineers who designed the dam that they used. And I believe they got over 100 million, didn't they?
Yeah, I think it was that, yeah. And
it gives you a stomachache thinking about that one.
so and in BC, thinking about tailings dams across the province, there are dams with this size and this type of construction still in the province?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess the dam for Highland Valley Copper must be pretty huge. I mean, that's been going for a long time. Your question about underground mining, there's a trend that's happening that I notice with a lot of the biggest mines in the world. After they go a certain depth, what they're doing now is it's something called block caving. And that's an underground mining technique where they set off explosions over a wide area underground, and it's kind of gravity collected, and quite often it's automated, and they get the ore out, the rock out. But the issue is that it creates, I think it's subsidence, you call it, on the surface. So, because if you're blasting out a huge area below, it'll just kind of suck in. And the best example of where that's proposed is in Arizona. BHP and Rio Tinto have proposed to build this Resolution copper mine. And it's a super deep earth mine. It's almost entirely robotically mined. Like, it's the mine of the future. It's a really fascinating place. But it's super deep, super complicated. And what they're doing is they plan to have sensors virtually everywhere in the underground, and that way, the trucks that do the unmanned machines can learn from their mistakes, and all the machine learning and stuff that's going to happen there. So it's a test case. But the final irony of Resolution, which is, like I said, an enormous mine that could supply a lot of copper for the U.S., which is very attractive to them right now because they don't want to be reliant on other places, or they're hoping to be less. The funny twist of it is that when you're doing a really deep mine like that, usually physics is your biggest challenge. But in their case, social license on the surface is the biggest problem, because there's this I think all of the tribal groups in Arizona are opposed to it, and including one Apache group that the subsidence from underground mining is going to affect some of their sacred sites, and they're not having it.
So in your opinion, then underground is no better than open pit?
No, well, it removes less rock, and it does disturb less rock. I mean, I think, again, it's that case-by-case basis, right? It depends on a lot of variables, but it does move less rock, which theoretically less tailings and less waste rock, so that seems positive.
Great. Thanks. I'll go to you over there.
surgical methods to mine. So there's a lot of work. It's so complicated, though. It's really complicated.
Yeah. So, thank you. The comment was just about some of the different methods that have been developed, including underground mining underneath an already open pit, and different types of tailings, dams, constructions, and methodologies for reducing the amount of tailings that we see. So thank you for that. I'll try someone new, and then if we have time, we'll get back to second questioners, if that's okay. In the back with the black and white.
Yeah. On lithium, Quebec's becoming an important hard rock lithium source as well. A lot of the gold exploration companies switched over to lithium in Quebec. But I wanted to ask you about gold. Like, I'm interested in, I'm looking forward to reading your book. But gold, like, you know, the jewelry, like the hold it has on people's imaginations in the world's most populous countries, and then also central banks and the power shifts that are happening in the world right now, and you know, the possibility of other currencies emerging beyond U.S. dollar dominance. So I'm just curious, like, how do you, any sort of cap on gold mining will increase the price because of the demand, which will increase the demand. So, like, how do we get from here to there? You know what I mean? Like, what are some ideas, or how do you propose to?
The question was around gold. Why are we so obsessed with it? And but the idea of that if we do decide, for example, that we don't want to mine gold anymore, it'll increase the price, and will that still, you know, encourage people to leave it in the ground if we don't need it?
One thing that so I did this thought experiment in the afterword of my book, where I said, you know, let's imagine if we could just, you know, not stop doing in industrial gold mining. And one thing that came out that I thought was really neat was that I talked to someone who had worked for Barrick. Barrick is one of the biggest gold companies in the world. And they had come up with this plan, and they experimented with this, and Barrick had looked seriously at this, at least according to their former employee that I interviewed, where what they were going to do is, because like about 40% of the gold that is produced ends up sitting like in a municipal jail cell in bullion form, right? Like sort of an underground storage. What's stopping us from exploring for gold and knowing for sure, as much as we can, what's in the ground, and not even digging it up, and fencing it off and selling that gold? And maybe you can have the local community take care of that and earn money from it as well. So the idea of using nature as a vault, basically. And it seemed like a brilliant idea, and they were going to use blockchain to keep track of it, and it sounded great. And then there was a merger, and what often happens is that talk of doing that kind of ended. Now, and another point about gold is I've started to realize that my point in bringing up why we should stop mining gold was that it has very few practical uses. Like in our day-to-day, it felt like something that we could kind of, you know, we wouldn't feel it if we gave it up or whatever. And oh, what's going on? Okay. I kind of lost the train of my thought there. What was I saying?
You're imagining leaving gold in the ground. What was the argument? And then talking.
Right. Now, we could stop, or we can say we could stop, but the point that it's a lot of it, to me at least, is useless, is irrelevant because the economic inertia of gold is massive. The industry's built up around gold. It's almost irrelevant that it's useless. So many people would lose their jobs in the marketing, in the smelting, just absolutely everything to do with it. And one final little footnote was that Costco in the U.S. Last month did this trial run where they were selling gold bars, like fairly small gold bars. I forget how many ounces or whatever, and I was just like, wow, this is ridiculous. And then I found out that they were not only did they totally sell out, like they couldn't like keep them in the place long enough, and this speaks to the allure of gold that's so weird, is that I thought it was ridiculous, but then I went online and I looked at a picture of one of these little bars, and there was this beautiful design. It was like an art piece of artwork, and my eyes kind of glazed over, and I thought, oh, I'd love one of those. Do you know what I mean? Like gold it's something that goes beyond what's logical, right?
Yeah. Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. I noticed we got an announcement that it's 8 o'clock, so we have time for, I think, one more question. And just we'll be around afterwards. The library closes at 8:30, so if you want to sit and chat, we'll be here. Chris will be signing books, and you can get a copy right over there. So for who's going to ask our last question of the evening, I think yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in this social aspect of mining. I'm still not sure if we're supposed to support mining industry or not. But I wonder if anybody works on the changing of the structure. Like today, most people who own land don't have mining rights for the stuff that is under the ground. And we see the problem that the mining rights would be issued to whatever company, usually by the politicians. We see what's happening like in Western Africa, etc. Is anybody working on changing the structure? Who owns the mining right and who has the rights to give to mining rights? Can at least land owners, like the farmers, let's say, have the rights? So if there will be mining developed, the First Nation people, whatever, they will get the benefits of the mining industry. Because right now, for me, everything like mining, it's almost like the blood diamonds. In poor countries, we have no idea what's happening. In rich countries like Canada, I just only follow the project here, the Ajax or Ajax, whatever you pronounce. Yep. That was shut down only because the local settlers, whatever the people, complained there would be additional dust. The issue was that there would be dust, yep. So they refused to give them the mining rights to the project, that I know. But we never talk about the social aspects, how things are happening in those other countries, and why blood diamonds was okay, even the blood diamonds are, again, about jewelry, never about industrial diamonds, etc.
So I'll try to summarize a little bit the question and maybe just talk about it broadly in terms of bringing it back to that question that you said at the beginning about this social license to operate in that, how important that is, and how are companies navigating that, and how, I guess, if people are interested in learning more about projects and how they operate in communities, how can they learn more about it and act if maybe there's something that they don't agree with, or find places to support good practices that are happening.
Okay, so there's a company called Inspire Resources that's doing some really interesting stuff. And so what they're doing is they're trying to look at new models for mining. And so big mines like Escondida with massive economies of scale, those will continue to be built by major, like sort of those big companies of the world. But so what this Inspire company is trying to do is they use like the example they're trying to do these mines where they call them modular mines. And so what that would be, and a good comparison for that is, so currently in the world right now, there's like at least 4,000 community energy projects. And these might be like clean energy projects, and where historically there would be a giant utility. But now there are these smaller scale community development or community developed projects where the benefits accrue to the community and the community is the center of the effort. They might draw on financing from all over the place, government, venture capital, that kind of stuff. So there's talk about doing that with mining and for smaller and for the smaller deposits. And that way, that would dispense of the problem also of having on 15 years on average to get a mine into production. And the model for this is something that they're working on, and Oz Metals in Australia has also been partnering with them. It's early days, but people are starting to look at alternative models for mining. And it's going to be slow because I think that if change is going to be disruptive, it's going to have to come from the outside. Because again, the inertia of business as usual is very, very powerful.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for all your great questions and conversation. Thanks, Christopher, for answering all of this. Yes. And so the library again closes at 8:30. Books are on sale right over here. And if you have any questions, we'll be milling about. So thanks again.